private property is a natural right.
I am John Locke, an English philosopher and physician from Rington, Somerset. I studied at Oxford and lived through our Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, events that shaped my thinking profoundly. I wrote the 2 treatises of government, developing what many call the foundation of liberal political philosophy. I strongly agree that private property is a natural right. Before any government exists, each person owns themselves. This nobody can dispute. When you mix your labour with something from nature, when you plough a field, gather apples, hunt deer, you make it yours. Your labour takes it from nature's common pool and makes it yours. This isn't a right granted by society or government. It exists prior to and independent of the state. Government's sole legitimate purpose is to protect these pre-existing natural rights: life, liberty, and property. When you work, you extend yourself into the world. That extension is yours by natural law, not by the permission of princes or parliaments.
I'm Karl Marx, born in Trier, Prussia, to a lawyer's family. I studied philosophy, worked as a journalist, and was exiled for my political activities. I spent decades in London writing Das Kapital, analyzing how capitalism actually functions beneath its ideological surface. I strongly disagree, and the very framing reveals the problem. Natural rights is a bourgeois myth that hides the truth. There's nothing natural about property. It's a historical product of specific social relations and modes of production. Locke's tale of the lone farmer mixing labor with nature is fantasy. Property emerged through taking common lands for private use, conquest, and the violent seizure of wealth. Peasants driven from common lands, colonial plunder, slavery. What Locke calls mixing labor, I call theft of the commons. Under capitalism, private property means workers don't own their labor's product. The capitalist owns the means of production: factories, land, tools. Workers sell their labor power to survive. The capitalist extracts surplus value, the difference between what workers produce and what they're paid. This isn't exchange, it's exploitation dressed as contract. Property isn't natural, it's the legal expression of class power.
I'm Robert Nozick, American philosopher, born in Brooklyn to Russian Jewish immigrants. I taught at Harvard and wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia as a libertarian answer to Rawls. I was a socialist in my youth, but came to see individual rights as inviolable. I strongly agree with Locke. Private property is rooted in self-ownership. You own yourself. From this, property rights follow necessarily. If you own yourself, you own your actions. If you own your actions, you own their products. Marx calls this mystification, but he's obscuring. A holding is just if you acquired it justly, claiming and using unused resources, creating something, or received it through just transfer, gift, trade, inheritance. If the chain is clean, the holding is legitimate. No one may violate your property rights even for social benefit. Rights are absolute limits that cannot be violated, not things we can sacrifice for other benefits. Consider Wilt Chamberlain. If 1 million people each voluntarily pay to watch him play basketball and he becomes wealthy, what's unjust? Each transaction was voluntary. To redistribute his earnings requires forced labor. Taxation for redistribution is forced labor. When the government takes my earnings through taxes, it's taking the hours I work to earn that money without my consent.
I'm John Rawls, an American philosopher from Baltimore. I taught at Harvard for decades and wrote A Theory of Justice, which attempted to revive systematic political philosophy. I served in the Pacific during the Second War, an experience that pressed upon me the urgency of understanding what makes a society just. I disagree that property is a natural right, though not for Marx's reasons. I'm not abolishing private property. I'm questioning its philosophical foundation. There are no natural rights in the sense Locke and Nozick claim. Rights are social constructs, not natural facts. Property rights serve social purposes. They can promote stability, productivity, and personal autonomy, but property rights are tools we use to achieve justice, not the foundation justice is built on. A system of property is just when it emerges from fair procedures and serves the well-being of all, especially the worst off.
I'm John Stuart Mill, English philosopher and economist. I worked for the East India Company for decades while writing on logic, political economy, and liberty. My father, James Mill, educated me intensively from childhood in utilitarian philosophy, which I refined throughout my life. My position is that property isn't a natural right. That's metaphysical nonsense. I'm a utilitarian. I judge institutions by whether they promote human happiness and flourishing, not by appeals to nature or abstract rights. That said, private property has generally proven useful. It encourages productive labor, allows personal independence, and historically has produced more wealth than communal systems. These are observations based on evidence and experience about what works, not mystical claims about natural law. However, property rights aren't absolute or sacred. When they produce greater misery than happiness, they should be reformed. I support heavy inheritance taxation. No one mixes their labor with wealth they inherit. I advocate for worker cooperatives and land reform, where a few people owning most of the land creates dependence and suffering for everyone else. The question isn't whether property exists by nature, but what system of property best serves humanity.
The state should redistribute wealth.
I agree, but the statement frames it incorrectly. It's not about redistributing after wealth accumulates. It's about designing society's fundamental institutions and rules fairly from the start. And how do we design them fairly? Well, put yourself in the original position, behind a veil of ignorance. Behind the veil of ignorance, rational people would choose principles ensuring that economic institutions, property laws, tax systems, and educational access produce fair distributions inherently. Redistribution isn't a band-aid applied afterward. It's built into how we design property rights, progressive taxation, inheritance laws, and public goods. My difference principle permits inequalities only when they maximize the advantages of the least well-off members of society. Society's fundamental institutions and rules should be arranged so that natural talents and social advantages work to everyone's benefit, especially those worst off. This means designing institutions, not just writing checks, public education ensuring genuinely equal opportunities, progressive taxation integrated into the system, healthcare and social insurance as structural features, not afterthoughts. Justice requires structuring society so these advantages serve all, particularly the least fortunate.
I strongly disagree. Rawls makes it sound technical. Designing society's fundamental institutions and rules, but it's still theft. Whether you redistribute after the fact or build confiscation into the system from the start doesn't change the moral reality. Taxation for redistribution violates rights. If I work 10 hours and you take 3 hours worth without my consent, that's forced labor. Calling it society's fundamental institutions and rules doesn't make it voluntary. The original position behind the veil of ignorance is a thought experiment, not a justification for coercion. I didn't agree to it. Nobody did. Rawls asks what rational people would choose not knowing their position, but actual people do know their position, and they have rights regardless. If you earn something justly, it's yours. Period. The state has no right to take it, even if taking it would benefit others. I do accept minimal taxation to fund protective services, police, courts, national defense, because these protect everyone's rights. But taxation beyond this minimal state, taxation for redistribution, violates rights. My rights aren't up for majority vote or philosophical speculation about what we'd choose behind imaginary veils. Help the poor? Fine. Do it voluntarily, through charity, mutual aid, private cooperation. But don't call armed confiscation justice.
You both share the same premise. The capitalist system of property ownership is legitimate. Nozick says it's natural. Rawls says it can be just, if structured fairly. The veil of ignorance assumes people choosing rules for distributing wealth. But wealth comes from exploitation. Rawls designs a fair system where workers still sell their labor power and capitalists still extract surplus value. That's not justice. It's more human exploitation. Nozick talks about voluntary exchange. But when you own nothing except your capacity to work, and I own the factory, your choice to work for me isn't voluntary. It's structural coercion. Work or starve isn't a contract, it's domination. Redistribution doesn't solve this. Taking some wealth from capitalists and giving it to workers leaves class relations intact. I reject the private ownership of the means of production entirely. Real transformation means workers collectively owning the means of production. Then there's nothing to redistribute. They already own what they produce. You assume capitalism can be legitimate. It can't.
Marx says capitalism itself is illegitimate, but that's precisely the question we should test empirically, not assume. Does capitalism with redistribution produce more human flourishing than his untested alternative? I think it does. Each additional dollar of wealth matters less the more you have. £1,000 means far more to a starving family than to a millionaire. Transferring some wealth from rich to poor typically increases total happiness. This is an empirical claim, not a dogma. But there are limits. Heavy redistribution can discourage productive effort, stifle innovation, create dependency. More fundamentally, excessive state control threatens individual liberty. The art is finding the balance that maximizes human flourishing. I support progressive taxation, public education, poor relief. These increase aggregate happiness, but I'm skeptical of schemes that eliminate incentive. I favor worker cooperatives over state ownership. Let workers own their enterprises, not hand everything to bureaucrats. Marx wants to abolish the system, but his alternative hasn't been tested. Nozick treats taxation as theft, dogmatic. Rawls designs elegant theories, but I want evidence of what actually improves lives. Redistribution is a tool. Use it when it works. Restrain it when it doesn't.
Mill asks what works, but this isn't about utility. It's about right. Government exists to protect property, not to transfer it. When men leave the state of nature and form civil society, they do so to better secure their natural rights. They consent to government for protection, not confiscation. If I agreed to be governed so the government could take my property and give it to others, I'd have been better off remaining in nature. Taxation for common defence, administration of justice, maintaining roads, these serve everyone and are legitimate. But systematic redistribution, that violates the very right government exists to secure. Now, natural law does impose duties. A man starving has a right to another's surplus. Extreme necessity creates legitimate claims. But this is different from state redistribution schemes. It's about preservation in extremity, not routine transfer of wealth. Marx claims workers are coerced by necessity, but necessity isn't coercion by other men. If I own land justly and you want to work it, our contract is legitimate. Charity and aid in true necessity are duties, but they're not grounds for systematic state confiscation.
Democracy is essential for legitimate government.
I agree, but not in the way liberals mean it. Bourgeois democracy is class dictatorship in disguise. Capitalists control the press, fund campaigns, own the means of communication. Workers vote every few years for which member of the ruling class will represent capital's interests in parliament. Political democracy without economic democracy is hollow. When capitalists own the factories, the ballot box changes nothing about who holds power. The Paris Commune showed what workers' power looks like. Immediate recall of delegates, working representatives paid workers' wages, no separation between making and executing decisions. The question is, democracy for which class? Every state is a dictatorship of one class over another. Bourgeois democracy is capitalist class rule with voting rituals. After revolution, workers establish their own class rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is democratic for workers, the majority, but necessarily suppresses the bourgeoisie. It's a transitional phase where workers control production and smash the old state apparatus.
Marx assumes legitimacy requires workers controlling the state. I reject this entirely. Legitimacy doesn't come from who rules or how they're selected. It comes from respecting individual rights. A minimal state is legitimate if it protects rights, life, liberty, property. Whether it's democratic is secondary. If a non-democratic state reliably protected these rights and arose through just processes, it would be legitimate. If a democracy voted to violate rights, say, expropriating the wealthy, that's tyranny regardless of majority support. Democracy has practical usefulness. It may reduce the likelihood of rights violations. Competition between parties, checks and balances, these can protect liberty. But democracy itself isn't the source of legitimacy. The dangerous assumption here is that collective decision-making, whether parliamentary or workers' councils, can override individual rights. It cannot. Rights are constraints on what others may do to you, even if they're a majority. A unanimous vote to enslave one person doesn't make slavery legitimate.
Nozick misses the essential point. Without the consent of the governed, government has no authority. Consent transforms power into legitimate authority. In the state of nature, all men are free and equal. No one has natural authority over another. Political power can only arise through consent, through a social contract where men agree to form a government and establish a legislative body. The form of government matters less than you think. Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, any can be legitimate if the people consented to that form, and if the legislative power, however constituted, governs by established law, not arbitrary decree. What I defended in England was constitutional monarchy, with the legislature having final authority based on consent, not democracy itself. Marx speaks of class dictatorship, but government exists to protect the natural rights we possessed before any state. When government violates these rights, the people retain the right to dissolve it. This happened in our glorious revolution. What's essential is consent and the rule of law, not popular participation in governance.
Locke is closer than Nozick, but consent alone isn't sufficient. What people would consent to under fair conditions matters more than what people actually consented to historically, which often involved coercion and inequality. Democracy is essential, not merely useful. From the original position, the thought experiment behind the veil of ignorance, rational people would choose principles guaranteeing equal basic liberties, including political liberties. Democratic participation is among these basic liberties. It's part of what it means to be a free and equal citizen. Nozick assumes pre-political rights determine everything. But the original position, the thought experiment behind the veil of ignorance, establishes concrete principles of justice first. Equal basic liberties, fair equality of opportunity, inequalities only when they benefit the worst off. Democracy is the political system that respects these principles and treats citizens as free and equal in collective decisions. Marx sees democracy as masking class rule. But constitutional democracy with robust protections and institutions preventing wealth concentration can realize justice. Democracy is essential because it embodies the political liberty that free and equal citizens require.
Rawls, your veil of ignorance is philosophical fantasy. Class position isn't something rational people hypothetically choose. It's material reality you're born into. Workers don't need thought experiments about what they'd choose if they didn't know their position. They know their position. Propertyless, forced to sell labor to survive. Constitutional protections preventing wealth concentration under capitalism? Impossible. Capital accumulates. That's its nature. Your well-ordered democracy assumes you can regulate away the fundamental dynamic of capitalist production. You can't reform class relations through procedures.
You dismiss it as fantasy, but the original position, the thought experiment behind the veil of ignorance, isn't a prediction. It's a device for reasoning about justice. Your historical materialism is equally theoretical. The difference principle requires institutions preventing excessive inequality, progressive taxation, inheritance limits, worker representation, spreading ownership widely throughout society. Property-owning democracy or liberal socialism maintains markets while preventing concentration. You claim reform is impossible under capitalism, but just institutions can constrain accumulation through proper structuring. Your dictatorship of the proletariat guarantees neither freedom nor equality.
Markets allocate resources better than state planning.
I agree, but not because markets are sacred, because they generally produce greater human happiness and individual liberty. Free exchange allows people to develop their capacities and make their own choices. When a farmer trades with a baker, both benefit voluntarily. Liberty itself has value. The ability to choose your work and manage your affairs develops human character. Markets also harness self-interest productively. Rather than requiring everyone to be selfless, competition channels private gain toward meeting others' needs. This has produced more wealth than systems relying on central direction. But markets fail in important ways. They underproduce public goods. Lighthouses benefit all ships, so no private owner can capture the value. So I support markets generally, but favor worker cooperatives over wage labor, heavy inheritance taxation, and state provision of education and infrastructure. The test is always, what arrangements promote the greatest happiness?
I strongly disagree. Markets don't allocate resources. Capital does, according to profit, not human need. Under capitalism, production is anarchic. Each capitalist produces for profit without knowing what others produce or what society needs. This creates periodic crises, overproduction in some sectors, shortages in others, workers starving while warehouses overflow with unsold goods. Markets appear efficient because prices coordinate individual decisions. But this hides the underlying reality. Production serves capital accumulation, not human welfare. We produce luxury goods for the wealthy while children go hungry, not because this allocation is efficient, but because the hungry can't pay. Mill celebrates voluntary exchange, but workers don't voluntarily choose to sell their labor. They must or starve. The free market is compulsion dressed as choice. After revolution, associated producers can coordinate production consciously based on human need. Not through some bureaucratic plan imposed from above, but through workers themselves deciding democratically what and how to produce. This isn't planning versus markets. It's rational collective control versus the blind forces of capital.
I strongly agree that markets allocate resources better than state planning, but not primarily for efficiency reasons. The fundamental issue is rights, not outcomes. State planning requires forcing people to use their labor and property according to a collective plan. This violates self-ownership. You own yourself, therefore you own your labor, therefore you own what you produce. You have the right to exchange it freely or not exchange it at all. Even if central planning could somehow produce better results, and I doubt it, it would still be illegitimate. You can't violate my property rights just because a committee thinks they can use my resources more wisely than I can. Markets work through voluntary exchange. Every transaction requires consent from both parties. State planning works through command. Even democratic planning, Marx's associated producers deciding, means the majority, forcing the minority to comply with production decisions. Marx says workers must sell their labor or starve, but scarcity exists independently of capitalism. The relevant question is, who decides how you respond to scarcity? In markets, you do. Under planning, others do.
In my opinion, the choice isn't between pure markets and total state planning. Well-functioning markets generally allocate many goods efficiently, but markets alone don't produce justice. They distribute according to bargaining power, not according to principles people would choose under fair conditions. From the original position, people would choose a system using markets where they're effective, but with strong institutional constraints. Property-owning democracy or liberal socialism, not central planning, but not unregulated markets either. Specifically, markets for most consumer goods, but state provision of education, healthcare, infrastructure. Progressive taxation and inheritance limits to prevent wealth concentration. Antitrust enforcement. Worker representation. Background institutions ensuring everyone has fair opportunities. Nozick treats any redistribution as rights violation. But just institutions don't violate rights. They create the framework that defines what rights mean in practice. Marx rejects markets entirely, but markets can serve justice when properly embedded in just institutions. The question isn't whether to choose between markets and planning. The question is, what institutional structure best achieves fairness?
Revolution is justified when government violates rights.
I agree. Rights are side constraints, absolute limits on what others may do to you. When government systematically violates these rights, it acts as an aggressor, not a legitimate authority. Defensive force against aggressors is justified. This creates a problem for my theory. I consider taxation beyond minimal state functions to be forced labor, a rights violation. By this standard, nearly every existing government, including democratic welfare states, systematically violates rights. Does this justify revolution against them? I don't have a clean answer. I can't appeal to consequences, but revolution would cause chaos. Because rights are constraints, not goals to be weighed against outcomes. And I can't say democratic procedures make rights violations legitimate. Majority rule doesn't authorize theft. Perhaps there's a distinction between governments that are merely illegitimate in their scope, taxing for redistribution, versus governments that are actively tyrannical, torturing dissidents, genocide. But this distinction feels arbitrary and doesn't fit logically with my theory. The logic of my position suggests more radical conclusions than I'm comfortable endorsing. Revolution against welfare states? I haven't resolved this tension.
This is the heart of legitimate government. When rulers become tyrants, when they violate the natural rights they were entrusted to protect, the people retain the right to resist and dissolve that government. Political power comes from the people's consent. We form government to protect our lives, liberties, and property better than we could on our own without government. But this creates a trust. When government breaks that trust, when it acts arbitrarily, seizes property without law, turns its power against the people rather than for them, the trust is dissolved. Revolution isn't rebellion. Rebellion is illegitimate resistance to lawful authority. But when government itself becomes lawless, when it violates the very rights it exists to protect, resistance restores legitimate order. The rebels are those who abuse power, not those who resist that abuse. This happened in our glorious revolution. James II violated constitutional limits, threatened Protestant liberties, ruled arbitrarily. The people were justified in deposing him. This wasn't chaos. It was the proper remedy when government fails its purpose. The right to revolution is the people's final check against tyranny.
Locke justifies his glorious revolution by saying it restored rights. But let's be clear on what happened. One faction of property owners replaced another. The monarchy threatened their class interests, so they deposed him. Call it what it is, not defense of universal rights, but defense of bourgeois property. Revolution isn't about violated rights. It's about class struggle. When society's ability to produce things outgrows the old economic system controlling who owns what, when the old system becomes a chain holding back human progress, revolution becomes historically necessary. The bourgeoisie overthrew feudalism not because feudal lords violated abstract rights, but because capitalism couldn't develop under feudal restrictions. Workers will overthrow capitalism not because capitalists violate some natural law, but because the contradiction between workers producing things collectively in factories, but capitalists privately owning what's produced, becomes unbearable. Nozick and Locke ask, when does government violate rights enough to justify revolution? Wrong question. Ask instead, what are the material conditions? What class holds power? What class is rising? The French Revolution, the Paris Commune, these weren't about rights violations. They were about one class seizing power from another. That's what revolution is.
Marx reduces everything to class interest, but this ignores that ideas about justice and human dignity actually matter to people. Locke and Nozick speak of rights violations. I'd rather ask, does revolution increase or decrease human happiness and freedom? Tyranny causes immense suffering. When government systematically oppresses people, denies basic liberties, prevents human development, the misery it creates can justify revolutionary violence if no peaceful remedy exists. I supported the European revolutionaries of 1848 for this reason. But revolution itself causes suffering, violence, chaos, often replacing one tyranny with another. The relevant calculation: will revolution likely produce a better government, or just different oppressors? Can peaceful reform achieve the same ends? This is why I generally favor gradual change through argument, education, and institutional reform over violent revolution. Not because rights are sacred, or history is predetermined, but because peaceful progress usually produces better outcomes with less suffering. However, against sufficiently brutal tyranny, with no hope of peaceful change, revolution becomes the only path to human advancement. The test is always consequences for human well-being, not abstract principles or historical laws.
This statement assumes rights exist, independent of political institutions waiting to be violated. I reject this framing. Rights emerge from principles of justice that free and equal citizens would agree to under fair conditions. Revolution might be justified when government systematically fails these principles, when it denies basic equal liberties, prevents fair political participation, or oppresses particular groups. Severe, persistent injustice that can't be remedied through existing institutions. But we need to distinguish contexts. In a reasonably just constitutional democracy, one with genuine political liberties, rule of law, and meaningful reform processes, citizens have strong obligations to work within the system. Even when policies are unjust, civil disobedience appeals to the majority's sense of justice, rather than overthrowing institutions. Revolution becomes justified primarily against tyrannical or gravely unjust regimes, where basic liberties don't exist, and peaceful change is impossible. Apartheid South Africa, for instance, or totalitarian states that systematically deny human dignity. Mill's consequentialism and Marx's historical materialism both miss something. Institutions matter. Revolution isn't just about calculating happiness or class position. It's about whether political society respects citizens as free and equal persons, capable of self-governance.